Imagine the quiet hum of a world at its apex. The shimmer of gold mosaic reflecting in the winter sun. The scent of imported spice in a crowded forum. The silent movement of vast quantities of grain across a placid sea. This was the Roman world of the early 6th century. A world reconstituted, confident, and profoundly unaware of the microscopic guest it was about to invite inside. A biological catastrophe was brewing, one that would redefine the very concept of societal collapse. Join us as we respectfully uncover these hidden histories and soothe the curious mind. Our chronicle begins not with sickness, but with ambition. To truly understand the plague, we must first understand the profound, glittering, and ultimately fragile world it shattered. The year is 536 AD. On the throne, in the great palace of Constantinople, sits a man of unremarkable birth, but of absolutely extraordinary, almost manic vision. Flavius Petrus Sabatius Justinianus. We know him as Justinian. Justinian is a man possessed by a single, all-consuming and staggeringly expensive idea: Renovatio Imperii, the renovation or restoration of the Roman Empire. When we analyze the political map of this era, we see a world fractured. The Western Roman Empire, centered on Italy, had officially fallen in 476 AD, less than 60 years prior. To Justinian, this was not a historical ending. It was a temporary, unacceptable interruption. His gaze was fixed westward, on the lost provinces now held by Vandal, Ostrogothic, and Visigothic kings. He intended to take them back. He was, as the historian Procopius of Caesarea tells us, a man who never slept. Procopius is our most vital and most complicated primary source for this entire period. We must approach him with academic care, as he wrote, in essence, 3 different Justinians. In his public work, The Wars, Justinian is a heroic, pious conqueror. In the buildings, he is the master architect of a new Christian civilization. But in his private, posthumously published Anecdota, or Secret History, Justinian and his wife Theodora are depicted as blood-drinking demons, architects of ruin. The reality, as it so often does, rests in the tension between these accounts. But all 3 agree on the man's tireless energy. By 536, that energy had already accomplished what many thought impossible. His brilliant and perhaps tragically loyal General Belisarius had reconquered the entirety of North Africa from the Vandals in a stunningly rapid campaign. The Vandalic kingdom, a maritime threat for a century, simply evaporated. Roman eagles were, at that very moment, fighting to reclaim Italy from the Ostrogoths. The Mediterranean, Justinian felt, was becoming Mare Nostrum, our sea, once again. This ambition was not merely military. It was theological, legal, and architectural. If we were to transport ourselves to the Maze, the central street of Constantinople in 536, we would be standing in the largest, wealthiest, and most sophisticated city on earth. It was a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people, a nexus of global trade. and rising above its magnificent Theodosian walls, we would see the scaffolding-clad dome of a new cathedral, a structure designed to eclipse all that had come before it. This was the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. Only 4 years earlier, in 532, Justinian and the Empress Theodora had faced their own apocalypse, the Nika riots. The city was in flames, the throne nearly lost. But they held. And from the ashes of that catastrophic riot, Justinian began his masterwork, famously declaring, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." This was the center of the world. It was a civilization of silk, ivory, intricate theology, and staggering bureaucracy. To fund his wars and his building programs, Justinian was also a master legislator and tax reformer. He commissioned the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Code of Justinian. This gargantuan effort to collate, clarify, and codify 1,000 years of Roman law is, perhaps, his most enduring legacy. It became the bedrock of Western legal tradition. So, let us establish our setting with clarity. This is not a dark age. This is not a falling empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we, in retrospect, often call the Byzantine Empire, though they would have only ever called themselves Romans, was the inheritor of an unbroken 1,000-year tradition. It was technologically sophisticated, administratively complex, and commercially dominant. It was, in short, a golden cage. Beautiful, strong, and intricately connected. And the cage was about to be locked from the inside. What made this empire so successful? What paid for the armies of Belisarius, the marble of the Hagia Sophia, and the legions of bureaucrats? The answer is twofold: taxation and trade. And these two factors, the very source of imperial power, would become the vectors of its destruction. The Roman world was bound together by the sea. Justinian's empire controlled the nodal points of what we might call the world system of late antiquity. From the east, the Silk Road terminated at cities like Antioch, bringing luxuries from Persia, India, and even distant China. From the north, amber, fur, and slaves came down the rivers from the Baltic and the Eurasian steppes. But the most important route, the empire's absolute lifeline, ran south. It ran to the province of Egypt. Egypt was, and had been since the days of Augustus, the personal breadbasket of the capital. The system was a marvel of state-run logistics, an evolution of the ancient Roman annona, or grain dole. Every year, a massive state-run fleet of heavy sailing ships embarked on a journey known as the Cursus Publicus. They sailed to Alexandria and the various ports of the fertile Nile Delta. There, they were loaded with millions of bushels of wheat, collected as a state tax from the Egyptian countryside, the Kora. This grain fed Constantinople. It was a political tool, a social stabilizer. It kept the 500,000 souls in the capital fed and, just as importantly, politically quiescent. The Nika riots had taught Justinian what happened when the populace was unhappy. The grain fleet was the guarantor of that stability. It was the artery that pumped life into the imperial heart. When we analyze the logistics of this system, we see a marvel of late antique organization. But from a modern epidemiological perspective, we also see a profound vulnerability. This was a monoculture of supply. The entire state apparatus depended on this single, predictable, massive movement of organic material from south to north, year after year. And crucially, this grain was not transported in sealed, sterile containers. It was loaded in bulk into the holds of ships. It was stored in massive public granaries, the Horea in Constantinople. And where there is bulk grain, stored for long periods, there are commensal animals. There are rats. Specifically, Rattus rattus, the black rat, or ship rat. This creature is not a field rat. It is what we call a synanthropic animal, a creature that lives in intimate symbiosis with human civilization. It nests in the thatched roofs of grain silos, in the dark, warm corners of warehouses, and, most critically, in the hulls and rigging of cargo ships. It travels where we travel. And on the back of Rattus rattus rides its own silent companion, the flea, Xenopsilla chiopis, the tropical rat flea. This relationship, the human city, the synanthropic rat, and the parasitic flea, is the classical triad of plague. For centuries, this triad had existed, but for a pandemic to occur, a fourth element is needed: the pathogen. We must also consider the environment in which this system was operating, for the 530s were not normal times. As Justinian's armies marched and his architects built, the world itself was changing. Primary sources from around the globe, from Ireland to China to Peru, describe a bizarre and frightening climatic event. In the year 536 AD, a mysterious dust cloud, or dry fog, dimmed the sun. In Constantinople, Procopius wrote, "For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear." In Ireland, the annals record a failure of bread from 536 to 539. In China, yellow dust rained down like snow. In Scandinavia, the sagas hint at the Fimbulwinter, the Great Winter, that preceded the end of the world. Modern dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, confirms this. Trees from California to Siberia show catastrophically poor growth in the years immediately following 536. This was a global cooling event, what we now refer to as the Late Antique Little Ice Age. The cause is still a subject of intense academic debate. The leading hypothesis is a massive volcanic eruption, or perhaps two, in the tropics. The resulting stratospheric sulfate veil blocked the sun, cooled the planet, and caused massive crop failures. The result was devastating. The world grew cold, dark, and hungry. And this, we must hypothesize, is a critical destabilizing factor. When we analyze the ecological impact of such an event, a sudden cold snap places immense stress on all populations, including rodents. Stressed, hungry wild rodents are more likely to die off, and their fleas are more likely to seek new hosts. Those new hosts could be the black rats traveling with human caravans. Stressed, hungry black rats, in turn, are more likely to cluster aggressively in human-stored food supplies, bringing them into closer than ever contact with humanity. This abnormal climate, this dimming of the sun, created a world on edge. It strained the imperial food system, just as that system was about to come into contact with a novel and terrible enemy. For centuries, the identity of the Plague of Justinian was a subject of historical debate. Was it an exaggerated account? Was it smallpox? Influenza? A hemorrhagic fever? The primary source descriptions of buboes, the terrible swollen lymph nodes, were highly suggestive of bubonic plague, but definitive proof remained elusive. That changed with the advancement of a new field, paleogenetics. In the 21st century, scientists began to analyze the dental pulp from skeletal remains found in 6th century plague pits, mass graves, in Germany. The pulp of a tooth is a protected reservoir, and inside it, they found the fragmented DNA of the killer. The results were unequivocal. The pathogen was Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death 800 years later. This was a monumental discovery. It allowed us to place the event not just in historical context, but in biological fact. What we now understand is that the Plague of Justinian was the first of 3 great plague pandemics known to history, and the specific strain of Yersinia pestis responsible for it was a distinct branch of the bacterial family tree. A branch that, interestingly, appears to have gone entirely extinct, replaced by the different strain that would later cause the Black Death. But where did this bacterium come from? Yersinia pestis is a zoonotic disease. It does not naturally live in humans. It lives in vast, permanent reservoirs of wild rodent populations, such as marmots on the Eurasian steppe or gerbils in Central Africa. In normal circumstances, the plague circulates harmlessly among these wild populations. But occasionally, something disturbs this cycle. A climatic shift, like the volcanic winter of 536, could cause a collapse in the wild rodents' food supply. This event, known as a zoonotic spillover, forces the infected fleas to seek new hosts. These new hosts were the black rats, Rattus rattus, that traveled with human trade. And so, all the pieces are on the board. We have a newly stressed global climate. We have a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, spilling over from its natural reservoir, likely in Africa or Central Asia. We have the vector, Rattus rattus, traveling with human goods. And we have Justinian's empire, the most sophisticated, interconnected, and efficient trade network on Earth. Its roads, its ports, and especially its grain ships were not just arteries of commerce. They were the perfect climate-controlled transmission web for a disease. The empire's trade networks, reaching into the Red Sea, up the Nile, and deep into the Persian frontier, were designed to move textiles, ivory, and wheat. But they were now, unknowingly, moving plague. The golden age of Justinian, this meticulously rebuilt Roman world, was a testament to human order, commerce, and control. but it had created a vast, warm, interconnected ecosystem of cities, ports, and grain silos. It was a golden cage, perfectly constructed, waiting for its occupant. And in the year 541 AD, that occupant arrived. The cage was breached. The occupant, this microscopic agent of Yersinia pestis, had found its entry point. But to understand the full, terrible efficiency of its conquest, we must follow the trail of transmission. We must trace the journey of the patient from Pelusium.
The scroll confirms it.
Our primary sources, Procopius in Constantinople and his contemporary, the Syriac historian John of Ephesus, are both clear and unanimous on one critical point. The plague did not arise from within the empire. It came from the south. Procopius, in The Wars, states it plainly. It started from the Egyptians, in Pelusium. Then it divided and moved in one direction towards Alexandria and the rest of Egypt. And in the other direction it came to Palestine, the neighbor of Egypt. And from there it spread over the whole world. John of Ephesus, writing from Palestine, confirms this direction of travel. He watched it advance from the south, on the road, so to speak, from region to region.
Yes,
when we analyze these accounts with modern epidemiological knowledge, they are entirely credible. They are tracking a biological invasion. The ultimate origin, the deep reservoir of Yersinia pestis, is a matter of ongoing academic research. Some paleogenetic studies suggest a long-term reservoir on the Central Asian steppe, near modern-day Kyrgyzstan, which would later seed the Black Death. But the specific strain of the Justinianic plague and its entry point into the Roman world seems to point elsewhere. The evidence, both textual and genetic, leans heavily toward an African origin. The bacterium may have lain dormant for generations in a wild rodent reservoir, perhaps gerbils or other species, in the highlands of East Africa, near the sources of the Nile or the Red Sea trade routes. The climatic shock of 536, the volcanic winter, may have been the catalyst. Her disruption in the wild ecosystem, her collapse of the wild rodents' food supply, and the infected fleas jump. They find new hosts. Rattus rattus, the black rat, travelling with the ivory and grain caravans that plied the trade routes north. We can almost map its progress. It moves from the inland reservoirs, down the Nile, or perhaps across from the Red Sea ports of the Kingdom of Axum, with whom the Romans traded heavily. It travels, rat by rat, granary by granary, until it reaches the critical bottleneck, the choke point where all the commerce of the south was funneled into the imperial heartland. This place was the port city of Pelusium. Today, Pelusium is little more than ruins on the Sinai coast, its harbour long since silted up. But in 541 AD, it was one of the most vital, strategic and commercial hubs in the world. It was the gateway to Egypt. It sat at the easternmost mouth of the Nile, guarding the coastal road from Palestine and the Red Sea. And, most importantly, it was a primary collection point for the Annona, the Egyptian grain tax. It was a city of warehouses, of Horea, a city of stevedores, tax collectors, merchants, and soldiers. And it was a city of rats. Untold millions of them, living in a perfect, man-made ecosystem, an endless supply of grain stored in vast, warm, dark buildings. Sometime in the year 540 or early 541, the bacterium arrived in Pelusium. This is what we call the zoonotic spillover into the synanthropic or human-dwelling rat population. An epizootic, a plague among animals, must have begun. To understand the transmission, we must be precise. The vector is the flea, Xenopsilla chiopus. This flea ingests the Yersinia pestis bacteria when it bites an infected rat. Inside the flea's gut, the bacteria multiply rapidly, forming a thick biofilm that blocks its proventriculus, a valve leading to the stomach. The flea is now, in essence, starving to death. It becomes frantic. It bites with agitation. And because its gut is blocked, it cannot ingest the new blood. Instead, it regurgitates, and it pumps a slurry of blood and concentrated Yersinia pestis bacteria directly into the bite wound of its new host. In the granaries of Pelusium, the rat population would have begun to die off in massive numbers. The fleas, their primary hosts dead, would have sought the next closest warm-blooded mammal. This would have been other rats. But in the chaos of a busy port, with humans and rats living in close proximity, it would also have been the dock workers, the sailors, and the grain sackers. The first human cases in Pelusium must have been baffling and terrifying. But this was a provincial port. Its suffering was not yet the world's concern. The true catastrophe occurred at the next step. In the spring of 541 AD, the great imperial grain fleet, the Cursus Publicus, arrived as it did every year. Hundreds of heavy ships designed for one purpose, to carry the wheat of Egypt to the people of Constantinople. As the grain was loaded from the infested Heraea of Pelusium, the rats came with it. Sick rats, healthy rats, and rats that were incubating the disease. And on their backs, the fleas. The ships set sail. A Roman grain ship was a microcosm of the plague's ideal environment. It was a closed system, a wooden hull filled with food and a dense captive population of both rodents and humans. The journey from Pelusium to Constantinople would take several weeks, depending on the winds. In the dark of the ship's hold, the epizootic would have become an inferno. The rats would have died in droves. The starving fleas, their primary hosts disappearing, would have migrated, moving up through the cargo, onto the decks, into the sailors' quarters, into their bedding and their clothes. By the time the fleet passed through the Hellespont and into the Sea of Marmara, many of its sailors were likely already dying. When they docked at the Julian harbour or the Neorion in the shadow of the Hagia Sophia, they were not just delivering wheat. They were delivering the apocalypse. Procopius, who was in the city at the time, is our eyewitness. He records that the plague arrived in Constantinople in the spring of 541, and he gives us a crucial confirmatory detail. It began, he says, among the populace who lived by the harbour. This is a perfect description of a maritime vector-borne disease. The first cases were the stevedores who unloaded the grain, the tax officials who tallied it, and the workers at the massive horia of the capital, the granaries that stored the public food supply. From the harbour, the rats, synanthropic creatures that they are, followed the food. They fanned out from the docks, moving along the supply lines of the city itself. They travelled with the grain sacks, to the city's countless bakeries. They moved into the wooden-framed tenement houses, the insulae, where the poor lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions. They infested the sewers. They moved block by block up the hills of the city, through the great forums, and towards the aristocratic mansions and the great palace itself. The vector was now established. The city, with its 500,000 densely packed souls, was seeded. The human-to-human transmission phase was about to begin. When we analyze the symptoms described by Procopius, his clinical precision is chilling. He was not a doctor, but he was a keen and methodical observer. What he describes allows us to identify with near certainty the 3 forms of the disease. First, and most common, was the bubonic form. It began, he tells us, not dramatically, but with a slight fever. The victim might feel unwell, but would continue their daily business. The fever, Procopius notes, seemed to be of a quiet kind, from morning until evening, so that neither the patient himself nor the physician would have any fear of danger. There was no immediate sign of what was to come. Then, perhaps on the same day or the next, the bubo would appear.
Very well, I will take
The bubon is, of course, the defining clinical sign from which bubonic plague gets its name. It is a massively, painfully swollen lymph node. Yersinia pestis is a bacterium that travels via the lymphatic system. The bubo is the physical evidence of the immune system's desperate and failing battle to contain the infection in the lymph node closest to the initial flea bite. Procopius notes their location with forensic accuracy. They appeared not only in the hollow, as it is called, where the leg joins the body, the inguinal region, but also in the armpit, the axillary region, and in some cases by the ears, the parotid region, and on the thighs. What this tells us is where the fleas were biting. The inguinal and axillary nodes drain the limbs. People were being bitten on their arms, legs, and torso. Once the bubo appeared, the disease's course was rapid and brutal. The quiet fever was gone. The victim, Procopius says, would fall into one of 2 states, a deep coma or a violent delirium. Those in the coma, he writes, were like men who had been overcome by sleep. They forgot all those who were familiar to them, and if anyone cared for them, they would eat, but if not, they would die of starvation. This is a description of septic shock, a systemic organ failure as the bacteria overwhelm the body. The other group, the delirious, were beset by sleeplessness and delusions. They would shout at the top of their voices and were suspicious that men were coming to destroy them. They would throw themselves from their beds or even from their windows in a desire for death. Procopius notes with a scholar's fascination that the physicians of the day were utterly baffled. They were inheritors of the Hippocratic and Galenic traditions of medicine, which were based on the balance of the 4 humours. This new disease fit none of their models.
It contradicts everything
The physicians,
we know.
he writes, disagreeing with each
Look at this
other,
diagram.
were at a loss. They tried lancing the buboes, which sometimes seemed to help, but more often hastened death.
Hold him
They
still.
tried
It
different
has to be
poultices,
done. You'll kill
different
Stop
diets.
this madness, you'll rupture it.
Nothing worked.
There is no other way.
This was bubonic plague. It was terrifying, and it had a mortality rate of perhaps 60 to 80%. But it was not, we must note, the most efficient killer. Bubonic plague requires a flea. It is not in itself directly contagious from person to person, but as the disease progressed in a victim's body, it could mutate. If the bacteria overwhelmed the lymph nodes and flooded the bloodstream, it became septicemic plague. This is plague in the blood. Procopius seems to describe this perfectly. There were some who died at once, having no visible token of the disease. They would be walking, talking, and then simply collapse. The septicemic form kills so quickly, often within 24 hours, that the immune system does not even have time to form a bubo. Worse, if the bacteria reached the lungs, it became pneumonic
Make
plague.
way! Someone help him!
This was the final, devastating evolution. In this form, the disease is no longer dependent on rats or fleas. It is transmitted person to person through aerosolized droplets, through a cough, through a sneeze, through simply talking in close quarters. John of Ephesus, our other key source, provides accounts that strongly suggest the mnemonic form was rampant. He describes a house in which all its inhabitants died at one time. He writes of a desolate and gloomy village which was completely wiped out. This level of total, rapid annihilation in a single dwelling strongly implies human-to-human transmission. The pneumonic form has a mortality rate that approaches 100%.
We will be careful.
It is, quite
The gods
simply,
protect us.
one of the most lethal diseases known to humanity. So, by the early summer of 541 AD, Constantinople was not just facing one disease, it was facing a three-pronged biological assault. A bubonic plague, transmitted by fleas moving slowly but inexorably from the harbour. A septicemic plague, killing instantly. And a pneumonic plague, passing invisibly through the air in the crowded, terrified tenements of the city. The Emperor's Golden City, the centre of the civilized world, the queen of cities, was now a sealed container. The grain ships had delivered their cargo, and the harbour was now silent. The city was holding its breath. The machinery of society was about to grind to a terrifying, absolute halt. The plague was now seeded in the harbour. The rats had fanned out, following the grain. The flea vectors were established, and the pneumonic, human-to-human transmission had begun.
And you look unwell, Effendi.
As the spring of 541 AD warmed into a humid summer, Constantinople, the queen of cities, descended into a quiet, orderly, and then total societal collapse. Our witness, Procopius, was there. He walked these streets, and his account, The Wars, shifts from the tone of a military historian to that of a stunned survivor. At first, he writes, the deaths were little more than the accustomed number. There was, we can infer, a period of denial, an abnormal rise in mortality perhaps, but this was a crowded ancient city. Fevers were common. Death was familiar. This phase did not last. Procopius continues. Then the pestilence grew, and the number of the dead reached 5,000 each day. And then it came to 10,000, and still more than that. We must, as academic researchers, pause at these numbers. 10,000 dead, every single day. Can we verify this? No. There was no city-wide daily census of the dead. It is almost certain that Procopius, in his shock, was reporting the figures as they were repeated in the terrified forums. A number that conveyed not a precise statistic, but an emotional truth. The scale was, quite simply, beyond counting. What this number tells us is that the systems for managing death, the very bedrock of civilization, were the first things to break. In the beginning, families buried their own dead. A knock at the door, a hushed conversation, a body carried out for a proper Christian burial with the customary rites. But the plague did not strike one member of a household. John of Ephesus, our other key witness, tells us of the houses that fell completely silent, so that not one person remained out of a number of 20 or 30 or even 40. Soon there was no one left to perform the burials, or the living were too terrified to touch the dead, having learned through brutal observation that the sickness could pass from a corpse, or at least from the bedding and clothes of the deceased. Procopius describes the scene. At first, each man carried the bodies of their own household and cast them into the tombs of others, secretly. But they were soon discovered, and this too stopped. The city began to fill with the unburied. Bodies lay in the open streets, on the steps of churches, in the porticos of the great avenues. The Mese, the central thoroughfare, a street of silk merchants and imperial processions, would have become a charnel house. And with the bodies came the smell. John of Ephesus, writing with the visceral memory of a survivor, describes the air of the city as thick with the foul and terrible stench of putrefaction. It was a smell, he says, that followed you, that you could not escape, a constant physical reminder of the scale of the dying. The social contract, the bonds of family and community, dissolved under this biological pressure. Procopius writes in a tone of deep shock, "Then all regard for fellow feeling and all sound rules of conduct had vanished from the city." We must analyze what this means. It means the sick were abandoned. Those who were in the grip of the sickness, he says, were objects of the deepest pity. For when they were struggling with death, they would cry out and dash themselves from their beds. And if they found anyone to care for them, they would long to eat. But if they were neglected, they died of starvation. Imagine the sound of the city, the great hum of commerce, silenced, replaced by shouting, by the cries of the delirious, and then, increasingly, by silence itself. The economy did not just slow, it ceased to exist. All work, Procopius states, was at a standstill. The craftsmen abandoned their crafts, and all food in the city was hard to get. This is a critical point. The grain fleet had brought the plague, but now no new ships were arriving. The docks were silent. The provincial fleets, hearing the rumours, would have turned back. And within the city, the infrastructure of life collapsed. The state-run bakeries, the pistrina, had no one to mill the grain, no one to bake the bread. The aquarii, who managed the great aqueducts and fountains, were dead or hiding. The city, which functioned on a complex, just-in-time system of state-subsidized food, began to starve. For the rich, this meant paying absurd prices for what little food was hoarded. For the poor, who lived on the daily grain and bread dole, it meant utter destitution. Famine now stalked the city alongside the plague. The Emperor Justinian, the man who never slept, was now faced with a crisis that his laws, his armies, and his theology could not touch. His first duty was not conquest, but a more primal one. He had to bury the dead. The imperial treasury was opened. Justinian appointed a high official, the referendarius Theodorus, to create a burial corps, paying vast sums from his own funds. John of Ephesus calls this group the Silogoi. These were men, likely from the lower classes, given tools and gold, tasked with the most terrible work imaginable. They went from house to house, breaking down doors and dragging out the dead. They loaded them onto carts at first, but where to take them? The cemeteries on the Pera side of the Golden Horn were full. They were more than full. They were fields of exposed, decomposing bodies. The Silogoi began, instead, to commandeer the mass graves of the poor. They dug vast pits, lakoi, and, according to John of Ephesus, they put in a layer of corpses, and then a layer of earth, trampling on them, packing them in as one might pack sardines in a cask. But the death toll, that 10,000 a day figure that Procopius gives us, overwhelmed even this. The Silogoi could not dig fast enough, and so they turned to the city's defences. At Psyche, across the Golden Horn, the area we now call Galata, there were great stone fortification towers. They were part of the city's old defences. Theodorus ordered his men to take the roofs off these towers. What followed is one of the most harrowing accounts in late antique history. The Silogoi began to throw the bodies into the towers. They filled them from the bottom up. They piled them up in a heap, John of Ephesus writes, and when one tower was full, they went to another. When the towers were full to the brim, they were forced to put the roofs back on. But the pressure of the decomposing bodies within was so great that, he writes, the roofs were often forced off again, and a river of putrefaction would flow out into the streets. This is the ultimate breakdown of human ritual. This is not burial. This is waste disposal. This is the human form, the image of God in Christian theology, being treated as refuse, because the sheer volume of death left no other choice. The psychological trauma on the survivors, witnessing this reduction of humanity to its most basic, decomposing matter, is almost impossible for us to comprehend. The plague raged in Constantinople for 4 months. It peaked in the high summer and only began to wane in the autumn of 541. And at its very height, it did what no foreign army, no riot, and no assassin had ever managed to do. It breached the walls of the great palace. The palace was a city within a city, a labyrinth of marble halls, gardens, barracks and chapels, staffed by thousands. It was not, and could not be, hermetically sealed. The food, the water, the guards, the servants. The plague found its way in. And it found the emperor. Sometime in the high summer, Justinian, the master of the world, fell ill. Procopius, in the wars, states it with simple, stark finality. The plague, he says, also laid hold upon the emperor. He developed the fever. And then he developed the bubo. The entire imperial project, the Renovatio Imperii, the armies in Italy, the codification of law, the very existence of the Roman state was embodied in this one man. And he was now in a delirious fever, gripped by the same disease that was turning his capital into a mass grave. The city held its breath. The empire, for a moment, was leaderless. This is the moment where the secret history of Procopius, with its venomous detail, provides a crucial political narrative. With Justinian dying, the court fractured. All eyes turned to the Empress Theodora. Theodora, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and ruthless will, took control. She had saved the throne once before, during the Nika riots. Now, she moved to save it again. The vital question was succession. Justinian and Theodora had no children. The heir was not clear. The focus of suspicion fell on the military, specifically on Justinian's great general, Belisarius. Belisarius was in the field in Italy, but his name was on everyone's lips. Procopius alleges that Theodora, paranoid, watched the movements of the high command. She summoned two other generals, Buzes and the recovered Belisarius, to the palace. According to the secret history, she confronted them. She accused them of plotting, of saying that if Justinian died, they would not accept another emperor chosen in Constantinople, meaning an emperor chosen by her. Buzes, terrified, allegedly said, "God grant that the emperor may recover, but if this should not be the case, I will not obey any other, but I will devote my life to the Roman state." To Theodora, this was treason. It was a general claiming the right to choose the next emperor. Buzes was arrested and, according to Procopius, vanished into the secret dungeons beneath the palace, the House of Oblivion. Belisarius, the great hero, was stripped of his command and his wealth and fell into deep imperial disfavor. This entire episode reveals the political fragility that the plague exposed. The disease was not just a biological crisis, it was a profound political one. It attacked the very center of power, and in doing so, revealed the paranoid, personal, and fragile nature of Justinian's autocracy. And then, the impossible happened. Against all statistical odds, Justinian survived. The primary sources do not detail his recovery. They simply state that he had the bubo. He fell into the crisis, and he emerged from it. He was one of the very few, the lucky, who fought the infection and won. We can only speculate on the impact of this. To the pious, it was a miracle. God had tested his chosen emperor and found him worthy. He had spared his servant. But when we analyze the later actions of Justinian, as recorded by Procopius in his secret history, a different picture emerges. The historian paints a man who became colder, more distant, more avaricious, and more paranoid. His trust in his generals, like Belisarius, was broken. His connection to his people, already strained, now seemed to operate from a place of deep psychological scarring. He had walked to the edge of the abyss, looked into it, and returned. The city he returned to was not the one he had ruled 4 months earlier. As the autumn of 541 turned to winter, the plague in Constantinople began to burn itself out. The bacterium had simply run out of viable hosts. It had killed so many so quickly that the chains of transmission were broken. Procopius gives us a final, haunting image of the city. He says that when the plague passed, it was not possible to see anyone in the streets of Byzantium, but all who had the good fortune to be alive were sitting in their houses or mourning their dead. The capital was a ghost town. The shops were shuttered. The forums were empty. The great Horea were now warehouses of death, not life. Justinian had survived. His city had survived. But the plague was not finished. It had used Constantinople as its beachhead, its amplification chamber. And now, with the resumption of even skeletal trade, it began to move. It followed the Roman roads north into the Balkans. It took the remaining ships west to Italy, to Gaul, to Spain. The plague had broken out of the golden cage, and it was about to devour the world. The silence that fell over Constantinople in the winter of 541 was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of the void, the auditory footprint of an annihilated population. Procopius paints a final, desolate portrait of the capital, a city of the living dead, where the few survivors were sitting in their houses mourning their dead. The shops were locked. The forums were empty. The great gleaming city of 500,000 people had been hollowed out, its human energy extinguished, leaving only the marble and the memory. Justinian had survived his fever. He had, in a physical sense, returned to his throne, but the empire he now governed was irrevocably broken. The plague, having used Constantinople as its great amplification chamber, was now loose upon the world. The first wave of the pandemic was a catastrophic, rapid-fire event. But the plague itself was not a single event. It was the beginning of a new and terrible cycle. What followed was the Great Hollowing, a slow, systemic and multi-generational collapse of the very foundations of the Roman world. We must first trace its journey. Having breached the imperial heart, the bacterium now followed the precise pathways of Justinian's ambitions. It travelled on the very ships and roads that were meant to carry his armies, his laws, and his tax collectors. It moved west. It landed in Italy, in the midst of the grueling Gothic War. We know this because Procopius himself left Constantinople and rejoined Belisarius's army, only to find the pestilence had followed him. He records its arrival in Italy in 542, where it ravaged the exhausted Roman garrisons, and, with perfect impartiality, the Ostrogothic tribes as well. It moved north, up the Roman roads into the Balkans, depopulating the very provinces that were meant to supply the empire with its best recruits. it travelled to Gaul, where the Frankish historian Gregory of Tours would later chronicle its arrival in his own cities, describing the buboes in the groin and the swift, inexplicable deaths. It crossed the Channel into Britain and Ireland, where the monastic annals record a great mortality, the mortam, which swept the islands. It also moved east. It struck the empire's great rival, the Sasanian Persian Empire. Primary sources from Persia describe the same swellings and rapid deaths. In a bitter twist, the plague may have inadvertently saved the Roman East, as the Sasanian king Khusro I, his own armies and lands afflicted, was forced to halt his campaigns. The plague was a terrible, indiscriminate peacemaker, and it moved south, completing its circuit, reinfecting Syria and Palestine. It is here that we rejoin our other great witness, John of Ephesus. John was a bishop, and his duties forced him to travel. He left us a primary source document that is, in its own way, more chilling than the urban horror of Procopius. He describes what it was like to move through a rural world that had been emptied. He writes of his travels through the countryside. We passed by village after village, and we found in them not a single soul, but all were dead, and their houses stood empty. But the dogs and the pigs roamed here and there, with no one to call them in. He describes coming upon a farmstead. The grapes in the vineyard were ripe, bursting, but there was no one to tread them. The wine vats were full of the juice, but it had spoiled. The cattle stood in their pens lowing, but there was no one to milk them. This is the hollowing. This is the human experience of demographic collapse. This is not a number. It is the sudden, deafening silence of a working landscape. The entire machinery of human life, the harvests, the animal husbandry, the simple daily rituals, had just stopped. When we, as researchers, try to quantify the scale of this collapse, we enter one of the great academic debates of our time. The ancient sources in their trauma give apocalyptic figures. John of Ephesus claims 300,000 dead in Constantinople alone, a number even higher than that suggested by Procopius. He states flatly that in some regions of the countryside it left not 1 in 1,000. For a long time, modern historians tended to be minimalists. They viewed these numbers as understandable but wild exaggerations. They argued that the plague, while severe, was a localized urban event, and that the empire's decline was a long, slow process. But our modern understanding, particularly through paleogenetics and climate science, has swung the pendulum back. The work of scholars like Kyle Harper, synthesizing this new data, suggests the ancient maximalists were perhaps closer to the truth than we knew. The evidence is not just in the DNA found in 6th century mass graves. It is in the ice cores of Greenland, which show a sudden halt in atmospheric lead pollution, a sign that the great Roman mining operations in Spain simply ceased. It is in pollen analysis from across Europe, which shows a sudden, massive resurgence of forests. Trees began to reclaim fields that had been farmed for 1,000 years. This is called rewilding, and it is the physical evidence of a vanished human population. The most sober academic consensus now suggests a mortality rate for the first wave of 541 to 542 of perhaps 25 to 40% of the entire empire. In the great, dense cities like Constantinople, it may well have been 50% or more. This is a demographic cliff, a hollowing from which there was no rapid recovery. Because we must understand, the plague came back. This was not a singular event. It was the first wave of a pandemic that would last for 2 centuries. The plague returned in 558. It returned in the 570s. It returned in the 590s. It returned again and again, roughly every 15 years, just long enough for a new generation with no acquired immunity to be born and grow. This was the new reality of the Roman world. It was a world half empty, living under the permanent, recurring threat of arbitrary, inexplicable death. And this demographic vacuum caused every other pillar of Justinian's state to fail. The first to break was the most glorious, the military and the Renovatio Imperii. In Italy, the Gothic War had been a brutal slog. Belisarius, the great general, had been recalled in disgrace by a paranoid, plague-stricken court. His replacement, Narses, would eventually conquer Italy. But what kind of Italy? It was a Pyrrhic victory. The peninsula, shattered by 20 years of war and repeated waves of plague, was a wasteland. The reconquest had destroyed the very thing it was meant to save. More critically, the empire no longer had the manpower to hold it. The army, the engine of Roman power, was hollowed out. The plague had killed soldiers in their barracks, and, more importantly, it had killed the future recruits in their villages. The great recruiting grounds of the Balkans and Anatolia were depopulated. We see in the archaeological record that after 541, the great Roman frontier systems, the limes, begin to collapse. Forts were abandoned, not because they were conquered, but because there was no one left to garrison them. This demographic vacuum in the Balkans would, within a generation, create the opening for a new people, the Slavs, to migrate and settle, permanently changing the ethnic and political map of Europe. The second cascading failure was the economy. The Roman state did not run on glory. It ran on taxes. It ran on the Annona grain tax from Egypt and the capitatio, the poll tax on its citizens. This is what paid for the army, the bureaucracy, the roads, and the grain dole. When 40% of your taxpayers die, 40% of your revenue vanishes. This is where we must turn to the darkest passages of Procopius's secret history. He describes Justinian's actions after the plague with a bitterness that is almost visceral. He alleges that the emperor, desperate for funds to pay for the failing war in Italy, showed no mercy. His tax collectors, the logothetes, were sent out into the desolate countryside, and they were ordered to collect the full tax burden from the survivors. Procopius claims that Justinian enforced a brutal law known as the epibole, or compulsory contribution. This meant that a surviving landowner was now legally responsible for the taxes of his dead neighbours. Imagine a village of 10 farmers, 9 of whom are dead. The 10th farmer was now forced to pay the taxes for all 10. If we take Procopius at his word, this was not just cruelty, it was institutional madness. It was a policy that ensured the ruin of the very survivors who were meant to rebuild the world. When we, as researchers, analyze this, we see not just the malice Procopius saw in his grief, and anger. We see the rigid, desperate death spiral of a complex system. The state's expenses, the army payroll, had not changed, but its income had vanished. Justinian, the master legislator, was trying to use the old laws, the old bureaucracy, to extract blood from a stone. He was trying to run an empire that, demographically, no longer existed. The farms fell fallow. The survivors fled, becoming refugees, rather than be crushed by a tax bill for the dead. The economic engine of the ancient world seized up and died. Finally, there was the hollowing of the human spirit. The psychological shift. The world of 536, the confident, classical, ambitious world of the Hagia Sophia and the Renovatio Imperii, was gone forever. The generation that survived lived in a different, darker, and more fatalistic reality. We see it in the art, which becomes more abstract, more spiritual, more focused on the hereafter. We see it in the theology. The cult of the saints, powerful, personal intercessors who could protect a town or a person from the arbitrary hand of God, exploded in popularity. This was a world that no longer believed in the total power of the emperor to protect them. They needed a new, more powerful patron. The plague and its endless recurrence fundamentally altered the effect of late antiquity. It arguably accelerated the end of the classical mindset and ushered in the medieval one. The world was no longer a rational, solvable problem, as it had been for the Roman legislators. It was a place of mystery, of divine judgment, and of profound, recurring sorrow. Justinian would live for another 23 years. He would continue to build, to legislate, to fight. But he was ruling a phantom, an empire of ghosts. The great hollowing was complete. The golden cage, which he had so painstakingly built, was now just a vast, echoing and empty structure. When we step back from the immediate, visceral horror of the mass graves and the empty villages, we are left with a single, profound question. What was the ultimate meaning of this catastrophe? What did the Plague of Justinian do to the world? The first wave of 541 to 542 was the great demographic shock, the hollowing. But the true, world-altering impact of the pandemic lay in its persistence. As we have seen, the plague did not strike once. It returned again and again in a dreadful, recurring rhythm for over 200 years. There were major outbreaks recorded in 558, 573, 591, 599, and so on, with the last identifiable wave hitting Constantinople in 747 AD. This 2-century cycle of pestilence, this long pandemic, is the mechanism that truly remade the world. It acted as a great demographic cap. Any attempt at recovery, any brief resurgence in the birth rate, was cut down by the plague's return. The ancient world was not allowed to heal. It was held in a state of permanent endemic crisis. For much of the 20th century, we must note, the academic consensus tended to minimize this. Historians, focusing on economic and social structures, often dismissed the accounts of Procopius and John of Ephesus as literary exaggerations. The fall of the Roman West and the transformation of the East was seen as a long, slow, internal process. The plague was, at best, a contributing factor, a coup de grace to an already declining system. This was the minimalist view. But, as we have discussed, the hard scientific evidence of the 21st century, the paleogenetics that identified Yersinia pestis in 6th century skeletons, the dendrochronology that confirmed the volcanic winter of 536, the archaeological data showing sudden reforestation and the abandonment of cities, has forced a new and dramatic reassessment. We are now living in an era of a new maximalist consensus. This research allows us to say with authoritative confidence that the plague was not a footnote. It was, perhaps, the single most powerful historical actor of the late antique world. It was a biological engine of change that ended one epoch and forged another. Let us analyze the three great transformations that this pandemic precipitated. First, it ensured the permanent end of the Roman Empire as a Mediterranean-wide power. Justinian's dream of Renovatio Imperii was not just a personal failure. It was a biological impossibility. The empire he left behind in 565 was a hollow shell, holding a tenuous grip on a depopulated Italy and a ravaged North Africa. Within a generation, these reconquered lands were lost forever. In 568, just 3 years after Justinian's death, a new Germanic people, the Lombards, invaded Italy. The hollowed-out imperial garrisons, starved of reinforcements and tax revenue, could barely mount a defense. The peninsula fractured, and the city of Rome itself began its long, slow decline into a pastoral shadow of its former self. In North Africa, the story was the same. The imperial province, weakened by plague and Berber insurgencies, was incapable of resisting the next great challenge. And this brings us to the second and perhaps most profound consequence: the rise of Islam. In the early 7th century, the two great superpowers of the world were the Romans, Byzantines, and the Sasanian Persians. For decades, they had been locked in a final, ruinous war. Both empires were, by this point, profoundly weakened, having endured a century of recurring plague. They were demographically shattered, economically exhausted, and spiritually fatalistic. Then, in the 630s, a new, unified force erupted from the Arabian Peninsula. The armies of the Rashidun Caliphate, propelled by a new, singular faith, attacked both empires simultaneously. Crucially, it appears the plague had not penetrated the deep desert of Arabia. The Arab armies were, we can hypothesize, a healthy, unified population attacking two hollowed-out, plague-weary giants. The result was the most stunning geopolitical shift in history. Within 20 years, the Sasanian Empire was not just defeated. It was extinguished. It vanished from the earth. The Roman Empire, in the same short span, lost 2/3 of its territory. It lost Egypt, the granary that had been its lifeblood for 6 centuries. It lost Palestine. It lost Syria. This astonishing success, the redrawing of the world map and the creation of a new, vast, Islamic civilization stretching from Spain to India, is almost incomprehensible without the backdrop of the Justinianic plague. The plague had created a political and demographic vacuum, and the forces of Islam filled it. The ancient world of East and West was replaced by a new three-way system: a Latin Frankish West, a rump Byzantine Greek East, and a dominant Arabic Islamic South. The third and final consequence was the birth of the European Middle Ages. The plague, in ending the Old World, laid the foundations for the new one. The classical urban model, the world of the polis and the forum, died. The great, bustling cities of antiquity, now demographic death traps, shrank into small, walled towns. The survivors fled to the countryside. Society re-wilded. The complex, cash-based, state-run economy of the Romans collapsed. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, was now a fractured, dangerous sea. Trade evaporated. The world became local, insular, and rural. In this new, localized world, a new social structure emerged. The self-sufficient agricultural estate, the villa, which had once been a luxury, now became a necessity. This was the seed of the manorial system, the economic engine of feudalism. And finally, the human psyche was remade. The classical confidence in human reason and imperial law was replaced by a profound medieval piety. The world was now governed by the inscrutable and often terrible will of God. The only protection was not the emperor, but the church. Monasticism, a retreat from a fallen world, exploded. The cult of the saints, powerful local protectors, became the dominant form of popular religion. The world view of the Middle Ages, with its focus on faith, relics, and the hereafter, was forged in the crucible of this 200-year pandemic. A world of gold mosaics, global trade, and unified law was gone. A new world of iron, local loyalties, and profound faith had taken its place. And then, as mysteriously as it arrived, it vanished. Around the year 750 AD, the plague cycle stopped. The specific genetic branch of Yersinia pestis that had terrorized the Mediterranean for 2 centuries seems to have gone extinct. The world, remade and unrecognizable, was finally allowed to recover. It would be 600 years before the bacterium returned, in a different form, to be known as the Black Death. The Plague of Justinian was the first, and perhaps the most definitive, pandemic in history. It was a biological catastrophe that acted as a dividing line, a great, dark hinge in human time. It closed the book on the classical world and wrote the first, stark chapter of the Middle Ages. The chronicle of this plague is a story of fragility. It shows us how a human system, no matter how sophisticated, golden, or powerful, remains profoundly, intimately, and humbly connected to the natural microbial world. We have come to the end of our journey, tracing the path of this microscopic agent through a world of emperors and empires. The great cities are quiet now. The palace is empty, the long roads overgrown. When we reflect on these immense, silent histories, we find not a reason for fear, but a deep and quiet perspective. The human story is one of profound resilience, and in understanding these dark chapters, we find a sense of stillness, allowing the mind to rest in the vast, unfolding narrative of time.